Hi. Thank you. Thank you for joining us for the 2021 Special Interest Group presentation. And my name is Joel Weisz, and I'm a manager of Solution Standards with the PCI Security Standards Council. I'm also the chair of the Best Practices for Container Orchestration Tools SIG. And joining me, I have Mr. Randy Bartels, who was a participant in this year's SIG. Randy, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Joel. As Joel said, Randy Bartels, and I'm a vice president with KirkpatrickPrice. Among other responsibilities, I also lead up all of our PCI QSA capabilities.
Thank you. And now let's get right into our presentation. So this year's topic of the Special Interest Group was best practice for containers, orchestration, and tools, which of course has absolutely nothing to do with anything in these pictures. And I apologize right now for that joke, and there will be no more of those kinds of things said. Thank you.
Yeah. At this point, we should probably lay out the topics of this presentation. In this session, we'll be providing an overview as well as a brief history of the special interest groups, or the SIGs as we call them, as well as an overview of the development process, as well as identifying some goals of the SIG. And then next we'll move into just giving you an introduction to the results of the most recent SIG effort. And then finally we'll touch on what the next year has to come around the 2023 SIG process for that as well.
So first, a little background on the history of SIGs. SIGs are a community-driven event initiative. They're focused on payment security challenges. The process was established in 2010, and since then there's been over a dozen guidance documents produced by the SIGs. They include topics such as cloud, virtualization, e-commerce best practices, wireless, penetration testing, and PCI for large organizations. SIGs play a key part in developing resources that can help the entire payment card industry.
You know, to that point, Joel, over the years, the council has published all these different guidance documents that Joel just mentioned, right? And I think I've referred to every single one of them as a QSA from time to time. There's probably two that stand out for me. It seemed like a few years ago, I was on the world record to visit the most call centers for a single person. And it was that protecting telephone-based payment card data guidance that was absolutely instrumental in helping appreciate what those risks are. If I had to pick probably just one more, I could stand up here and talk about all of them, right? But if I could only just pick one more, it would probably be that scoping guidance document. How many of you familiar with that one, right? Exactly, right? I have said this to every single one of my customers over the last almost 20 years of doing this, right? Scoping is the first thing that we're going to talk about. And if we ever stop talking about it, it's going to be the very last thing that we talk about, right? And it's that scoping guidance document that really helps sharpen those conversations.
So let's discuss the SIG process itself. The process consists of a number of phases. SIG topics are proposed each year by members of the PCI community. All POs, QSAs, ASVs, CPSAs, QPAs, and PCI council members are invited to propose a topic during the open proposal period. Ultimately, topics are chosen through an election process by the POs who represent merchants, financial institutions, and payment processors. Working objectives are created from proposals and are known as the scope of work. This document is often referred to as a terms of reference, and it's used as a blueprint for the SIG. And from there, the content is developed by SIG members through an iterative and collaborative process of creation, review, edits, and finally approvals. So who is involved in the SIG process? The key participants in the process are the SIG members, who include employees of participating organizations, QSAs, ASVs, CPSAs, QPAs, and affiliated members. And they provide the subject matter expertise to develop the content of the SIG. So Randy, as a member of this year's SIG, can you maybe share some of your experiences in being part of this process?
Sure, Joel. You know, I've been involved in a number of these things over the years for the council and also for other industry organizations. And the thing that I always come away with is how much more I get out of these collaborative efforts than what I put in. Yes, I always make my contributions based on my areas of expertise. This time was no different. But when you get a group of technical experts together, and then you throw in some other perspectives, including probably some non-technical folks, without fail, every single time, I learn more than what I brought to the table. This, no exception, right? And so we had people on the SIG team who were not QSAs, that had not implemented any applications built on container-based technologies. And we also had some of the largest providers of container and container orchestration infrastructure on the team as well. And here I am somewhere in the middle of all of this, right? And you know, to see these different groups interact, what it really helped me understand is that not everybody took the same journey that I did, right? And so we'd make our contributions to the team, to the drafts. Those were then circulated, and then we discussed them on the next call. And you know, I think every single one of my contributions, they were poked and prodded and rearranged and rewritten, right? It's a collaborative effort. That's the way this works. But I am proud to say that when I look at this document, I can still recognize some of the things that I provided, even way back in the very first session.
Now, while Randy is a subject matter expert in the area of this particular area of technology, as were many of our participants, not everyone was, and that's a good thing. User experience made up an important part of the strength of the SIG. Understanding the non-SME perspective, who after all make up a large portion of the people who are going to use this document, is a key to a successful SIG. And there's room for every level of expertise and experience in this process. There are two other roles in the process. The PCI representative will chair, lead, and project manage the SIG work, and participating payment brands approve the final product. The SIG provides participants with the opportunity to really help the PCI community and the payment industry as a whole address some of the most pressing issues through a collaborative process of sharing their background knowledge and experience. So let's talk a little bit about the community. And Randy, given that you were part of this, of the community that, and you joined the SIG, what was your motivation for being part of this process?
Sure, Joel. There's probably a couple of things that brought me to joining the SIG. And, you know, so the first one was a couple of months, maybe even 4 or 5 months before the email came out, you know, to introducing the topic, right? I was doing a PCI assessment for a very technical mid-sized enterprise that had built their application on top of Docker, and then they had some Kubernetes that was being used to orchestrate everything, right? What I found in that assessment, they had over 200 Docker containers providing various parts of their application. And what I found in that assessment, absolutely shocking. There were Docker containers that had not been patched in over 7 years. And then there were Docker containers as well that were running Nginx web servers, handling the public traffic coming in. And those web servers had CVSS 9 vulnerabilities, and they were running as root. And the list just went on and on and on, right? And it's needless to say, this company did not pass their assessment, right? In addition to what I already shared about my personal reasons for engaging on these kinds of things, there's also an opportunity for KirkpatrickPrice to demonstrate some thought leadership and to influence the direction of the security industry at large. And I think that's a real benefit for contributing resources to the SIG.
So I can tell you that having been part of the 2021 SIG process myself and seeing the level of engagement by participants, I can say that I think that there's no better way to provide very direct input and, as you said, thought leadership into the PCI ecosystem than to be a member of the SIG. And with that, let's take a look at the development process and the results from this year's SIG document, Guidance for Containers and Container Orchestration Tools.
So it might be helpful to provide a little background into what containers can actually do. The textbook definition of a container is that it's a unit of software that bundles an application and all of its dependencies together, and then it abstracts or separates those processes and capabilities from the underlying operating systems, enabling containerized applications to run consistently across multiple platforms. I'm exhausted. I don't know about you guys, right? Okay, let's unpack that for just a minute, right? Containers solve at least two problems. There's the first problem of managing dependencies, and then there's the second problem of elasticity, right? For dependencies, the way that we used to run our applications is that we'd have one application running on a server, and it would need this version of some software in order to run. And then we'd have another application running on the same server, and it needed a different version of the same software in order to run. And that would create all kinds of headaches, right? And so we'd have different instances, we'd have unused CPUs, we'd have way more processing capability. It created all kinds of headaches, right? Well, with containers at play, each application gets exactly what it needs, and it's contained within its own little boundary, the container, right? Now let's talk about the second problem, elasticity. Let's compare that to operating system virtualization, right? We're all familiar with that. We've been dealing with that for 25 years now, the physical to virtual and then moving all that into, we know this problem, right? Containers can provide a level of process isolation that's at least similar to what we expect in hypervisors, whether we're using VMware or some other based hypervisor implementation, right? But where it might take minutes to bring up a new server and then maybe longer to configure it and get the applications ready to run, that's a very expensive process to go through every time we need to add more capacity to handle the user load. With a new container, on the other hand, we can bring that online usually in just a couple of seconds. Tremendous elasticity. Now, pretty much when you're doing any kind of containers at any kind of scale, you're also going to have an orchestration layer. With containers laying all over the place, you're going to be spending so much time constantly monitoring them, and that's one of the things that the orchestration tools does for you. Let's say that you have a web server pool in your orchestration infrastructure. You can set that up to run maybe, like, I need somewhere between 3 and 30 instances of my web server, right? And then you'll define the criteria when you're going to bring a new instance online. Again, it just takes seconds, right? And then you'll also define the criteria when you're going to dispose of them to conserve resources, right? But your application isn't just a web server that just serves up HTML. You also have some business logic. So you probably have some Python code in there, or maybe some Java. And with the way things are, you've probably carved this application up into a bunch of little pieces. We call them microservices. And this one handles authentication, and that one handles logging. And you know what? We're at the community meeting, so you got one that handles payment card data as well, right? So your application needs to know how to find all of these services, and that's also a function for your orchestration tools. And all of these layers, operating systems and containers and orchestration tools, application logic, and presentation tier, all of these different layers, they all add complexity. And there's at least one security practitioner who is fond of saying complexity is the worst enemy of security. It's these risks and this additional complexity that we're working to expose in this new guidance document.
So let's talk about the SIG paper itself, Guidance for Containers and Container Orchestration Tools. So what was the purpose of this document, and why was this guidance developed? One of the original objectives, as outlined by the terms of reference, was to provide stakeholders with the appropriate level of background on the technology. And as such, the SIG decided to include information on what containers are, what container orchestration tools do, and of course, what are the current best practices for securely implementing containers and container orchestration tools. So to be sure, there are other sources of high-level best practices more generally. But there really was a need for container-specific guidance in payment environments. And you know, when I first spoke to colleagues about chairing this SIG, the reaction I got was how excited people were to attend the meetings and to learn about containers and container orchestration tools. And that really drove home the point that what was needed was to provide the necessary technical background to better understand the best practices themselves. It was interesting, too, because people generally seem to understand what best practices were, around development, authorization, vulnerability management. But what they were looking for was, how do these best practices apply in a containerized environment?
So what did we do? First of all, we realized that we had to focus on establishing a level of baseline knowledge to ensure that the reader had a basic understanding of the technology. To that end, we included some foundational information for containers and for container orchestration tools. We have a glossary in the document. There's an explanation of the architecture in the document. We explain some of the advantages and disadvantages of using this technology. And finally, we even get some insight into when possibly using containers and container orchestration tools is not the right choice.
We realized very early on that we did not want to provide a generic list of best practices without providing the context of how these would be applied in a containerized environment. Though many best practices which are applicable to traditional deployments are also applicable to containerized deployments, our goal was to tailor the guidance to a containerized environment. To that end, we identified use cases and specific threats to containers and container orchestration tools that might be implemented in a payment environment. We then considered the possible best practices to address these threats for each use case scenario.
Let's take a look at some of the examples from the different sections of the guidance document, give you a feel for what's in there, right? This is just one diagram in the guidance document section where we're explaining about containers. The purpose of this diagram is to contrast container-based deployments to something we're more familiar with, bare metal and hypervisor-based computing. But it's this kind of insight from our stakeholders, conducted through the discussions in our SIG meetings, and most significantly from those members who did not have a strong understanding of the technology, that enabled us to tailor the contents of the working group and the format of our effort in order to meet the needs of a broader audience.
And speaking of threats, best practices, and use cases, this table, taken from the guidance document, provides columns of threats specific to containers and container orchestration tools and the corresponding best practices. These threats and best practices are mapped against a selection of possible use cases. The text is a little small here, so don't try to read it. And those are the applicable use cases. But in this example, it's noted that both the host operating system as well as the container images themselves should be scanned as part of the security best practices. We can also see that in addition to the base cases of scanning of production systems, scanning of container images should also be conducted as part of the container development process. The threats are grouped by common characteristics, of which 16 different threat types are identified, such as authentication, authorization, patching, etc.
But the guidance document goes one step further to provide a description and examples of each use case, and even an example threat scenario to illustrate the use of the best practice to address the threat. In this excerpt that we see here, we have a description of the use case, we have a graphic representation of the relationship between the different elements in the use case, we also have an example threat scenario, and then finally we also see the best practice in order to manage the risk.
And here, what we're showing is an example threat scenario provided in the document. It includes best practices to address the threats and the expected results. Now, to be clear, the resulting best practices and even the selection of use cases is not exhaustive. And the purpose of this document is to provide the reader with an understanding and appreciation of the common best practices in addressing real threats. The intention is not to be a cookbook of best practice recipes, but a starting point for understanding the place for best practices in securing containerized environments. So to summarize, the SIG set out to create a guidance document that would be used for for our very diverse group of stakeholders. And to that end, the guidance provides sufficient background information on key concepts related to containers and container orchestration tools. It provides best practices to address threats that have been identified as impacting containerized payment card environments. And it describes these threats and best practices through tangible, relatable use cases and scenarios that users may encounter in the real world. And so what's next? Well, the 2023 SIG, of course. And with that, the 2023 SIG is already underway. Some key dates to keep in mind: we have just opened the 2023 SIG proposal process, which runs until the 28th of October. Proposed submissions will be reviewed and consolidated, and the selection of proposals and the election process will begin January 30th and conclude at the end of February 2023. If you're an eligible PCI community member, this is your opportunity to get involved. Submissions for SIG proposals are being accepted right now on the PCI SSE website under the Get Involved and SIG tabs. We look forward to receiving your proposals. So hopefully this quick review of the guidance document of the 2021 SIG has gotten you excited about the possibilities of contributing and making a difference in the payment card industry. It's important to note that the PCI SSE is responsible for all content of all PCI documents. The content of the SIG, though, the real input is the result of active participation by SIG members. SIG members decide the format, SIG members provide the content, SIG members review the document, and SIG members conduct the editing effort. And the result is really a community-centric document. Thank you very much.